Hello and welcome back to the Rational Theology Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Sam Heninger. And Sam is an independent Latter-day Saint researcher working at the intersection of philosophy of religion and restoration theology. He studied psychology with a minor in business leadership and earned an MBA from Utah State University. He's developed his covenant possibility model, which is still a work in progress. We'll get into all the kind of intricacies of his working theological system today. Sam served a full-time mission in Idaho and Oregon and currently serves as an elders quorum first counselor and as a Bentonville, Arkansas temple ordinance worker. And you can connect to Sam on Facebook and Instagram under his name and on YouTube at LDS ConfidenceinChrist. And I'll throw his stuff in the description. Hello, Sam. Nice to have you.
Hey, LJ. Thanks for the intro. Yeah, like you said, everything that we're going to be talking about is a work in progress. This is really just me sharing as a layperson, not a trained philosopher or theologian. Just the more I've tried to understand this age-old conversation or dilemma of how is it that God knows everything, so he knows what I'm going to do, how then am I morally responsible? And it seems as though in some ways, everyone thinks across Christian history they've solved it, but no one is fully satisfied, so we keep talking about it. So this is my effort to just share my own thoughts, and if it's of benefit to anybody, add to it, adopt whatever you find interesting. But I think, especially coming from this restoration background, there are so many fundamental, building blocks that we start with that are different from how we typically talk about this conversation that I think we really deserve for ourselves to think about this from first principles.
That's super cool. And I guess maybe before we even get into the specifics of it, I'm curious, how long have you been interested in theology? What got you into sort of philosophical theology in the first place, and how long have you been working on the specific covenant possibility model?
Yeah, I'll say that I've probably been working on the covenant possibility model, CPM, and like you said, it's a work in progress. That's just a working title. We'll see if if something else comes out of it, but that's really come up just in the past year for me because I perhaps like many of your listeners, I'm familiar with Jacob Hansen, his channel Thoughtful Faith, and I'm active in his Facebook group, Thoughtful Saints. And every so often, this conversation keeps coming up. You may have seen videos of Jacob and Hayden Carroll going over determinism or free will and how do we talk about these things? How do we understand all of this? And it seemed like every time I proposed some sort of middle path, some sort of way of how can we honor both of these things, it got glossed over. It seemed like a lot of people were entrenched in one way of thinking or another. And so it just got me mulling over in my head and researching more and more. Why are so many people stuck on either God absolutely knows everything and it doesn't matter if that ultimately means you don't have free will? You're still free in a certain sense. And so that's why you're morally accountable. Or other people, which we'll get into this. There are different schools of thought, and it's been developing, but it seems like everyone is willing to make a compromise on a certain definition, a certain way of how these pieces fit together that no other side is willing to make. So that for me, ever since my mission, just really digging into the scriptures, it's been, I love talking about ideas, thinking about things deeply, but it really hasn't been until probably since COVID that I started taking things more seriously. And I say the big reason for that is everyone came to a fever pitch. There came a point where people started making decisions about their testimonies. And so I don't know how many people are gaining or losing their testimonies over the philosophy of time and these perhaps pretty intellectual ideas, but I just found that the more I can reason through and discover and enjoy this journey of learning through the scriptures and through other thinkers, that I just hope to find myself on solid ground as I continue through life.
Yeah, cool. No, that's great. And I guess that's kind of a good segue into maybe giving a historical overview of maybe the main kind of different people's theologies takes on like the intersection of free will and foreknowledge. So do you maybe want to give an overview of a few of the main historical ways of dealing with this problem of if God knows everything, how does free will play into the whole thing?
Yeah. So I don't know about you, but I certainly get my money's worth out of my ChatGPT Plus subscription.
Yeah.
I really abuse it and make it like really work for its money, and asking it difficult questions and really making sure that it's not just making stuff up. And so I realized that ChatGPT is like this generation's Wikipedia, like what it was for millennials back in the day, where it's like you automatically are under suspicion if that's something you're sourcing your information from. So take this all perhaps with a grain of salt, but I'm bringing up just as a way for us to set a foundation of understanding how do people typically think about this, and what have the best thinkers across history in Christian history thought about how do we solve this problem. And so to begin, it really comes down to like the two big philosophers, theologians, are Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. They're really ones that help frame this whole conversation. And you can help fill in some gaps if I'm missing anything, but I'll just run through a couple of these things and we can compare and contrast as we go through, because it'll start in like the 3rd, 4th century with Augustine up to Aquinas in, I think, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the centuries and all that, but up through the Middle Ages, and then we're going to get to, say, John Calvin, Jacob Arminius, Luis de Molina. So those three are like in the 1600s. And then in the last 30, 40 years, maybe if you want to say 100, if you want to include early thinkers, there's a thing called open theism, which if you have any sort of finger on the pulse of theology these days, you'll know that some of the big players in LDS theology, they prefer open theism. But even in my research there, I like to nuance it a bit and help perhaps cover some weaknesses or not cede ground that open theism generally does. So to jump right in, I'll just throw in some comparisons. Mm-hmm. So let's say with Thomas Aquinas, we call it Thomism, someone who subscribes to the theology, the systematic thinking of Thomas Aquinas, we call them Thomists. So we'll just run through this. Let's say like the first principle, the foundational thing, the idea that Aquinas was trying to defend. Let's just summarize it as saying that God is pure act, like and simple and in all ways perfect. Okay, so this is this is the classical view of God. And actually, before I go much further, LJ, mm-hmm. I think it helps for us as members of the church to understand, what can you say? How would you summarize what the classical view of God is?
Yeah, so the more classical theistic, Thomistic account of classical theism, I'd say can be characterized by a few like major commitments. And so you've got this idea, well, I guess, and even before that, fundamental to this, why these attributes come out is because the idea of God is kind of rooted in Hellenistic philosophy, and this concept that God is kind of comparable to like a Middle Platonistic conception of the one, or the form of the good or the beautiful, and so that God himself is kind of this uncircumscribed essence that undergirds all of existence and actually brings time and space into being. So God is pre-time, so he's eternal. He's outside of space and time because he's prior to space and time, and so God is utterly simple. He's absolutely divinely simple. So he's without parts. He's immutable. He's unchanging. He's impassible. So he's not subject to passions. And he's omnipotent and omniscient in a maximal sense. And so essentially kind of the classical theistic project of who God is trying to maximize, like, what would it mean for, like Anselm has his classical definition of God, that than which no greater can be thought. It's kind of this project to see what would be the properties of the greatest possible being who brings everything else into being. So that's kind of the way I'd quickly summarize it.
Right. And I say this, perhaps there's no way to say it other than a bit glibly, but for those of you who are at least semi-familiar with, say, like cartoons like Dragon Ball Z, like animes, or playing card games where there's new cards that come out, there's this idea in game design or narrative design where it keeps people get more and more powerful. And we call that power creep. So Anselm's definition of God, to me, seems like the ultimate expression of theological power creep. Like, well, God is whatever is the most perfect of all things. Okay. And they have their scriptural basis for that and their defenses and reasons and apologetics. But I appreciate you giving a summary of how that differs from how we understand God, one, as being embodied, so in a sense necessarily in time. And so when we talk, when classical Christians talk about God being outside of time, before creation, they mean that in a way that it's hard for us to understand, because the scripture will say that God is from everlasting to everlasting. That's what it says in the Psalms. And so we have a concept that God is within time, yet eternal. And that to me is like one, just as we go along, we'll start parsing out, here are some fundamental baseline assumptions that we make in our theology that can really change the downstream ways that we work out our reasoning in terms of how we answer this question. So to go down the list a bit more, and just, this is officially, Thomism is the system that the Catholic Church uses. Now, we can talk about how, as the difference between like the theology that is officially subscribed versus how lay people actually live their faith and how they typically think about their relationship to God. That can be different, but to the best of my ability, let's keep it as far as like official stances. And so Thomism is going to be nominally the most subscribed to system here. So we'll keep going down. Right. So as far as what our ground of knowledge is, God knows all by knowing himself as the cause. He's the first cause, the unmoved mover. And this comes from an assumption that I've been struggling with and playing around with quite a bit just today even. The idea that, and LJ, maybe you want to like run through the Kalam cosmological argument, or these ideas about how it's reasoned that infinity past, so time eternal in the past, can't actually exist. That there has to be something that caused everything. Because we can't do an infinite regress, and we talk about that, and we get lambasted all the time for subscribing to something similar to that. But I would love it if you could lay out to your understanding why they take that stance.
Yeah, I think and this might be more of a psychological reasoning than historical, but it seems that what God serves as, what God functions as for a lot of classical Christians, is he's just kind of like the thing that explains everything else, right? And so at the core of this idea of God being the first great mover is Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, which is essentially saying that everything that happens needs to have a cause. And so, kind of LDS theology differs in that God for us doesn't function as an explanation of reality. He functions as explanation for salvific soteriological reality, and some other things, maybe the beauty, the organization of the universe, but not for the actual existence of all the constituent parts of the universe. Whereas the classical God, for a lot of classical Christians, he answers kind of that fundamental question of why is there something rather than nothing. Whereas in LDS theology, we don't have an answer for that. Our answer is just there's a brute facticity to matter, to intelligences, and like you referenced the Kalam cosmological argument, right, which is that anything that comes into being has a cause. The universe came into being, therefore the universe has a cause, right? And so, but I think, and I'm not super solid on my understandings of infinity, like infinities necessarily, and infinite regress, but it seems to me kind of just like almost a priori that that's such a difficult question to answer that you couldn't really logically prove it one way or the other. So, but that's just my limited understanding.
Sure. Right. And yeah, trying to defend something that seems illogical, or at least an alternative explanation, can feel more logical and intuitive, even if it's ultimately going against what Revelation shows, that God is everlasting to everlasting. Again, we're starting to understand from these first principle ideas why restoration theology is so distinct. And of course, we're talking pretty specifically about these certain assumptions. Obviously, there's open revelation, like this is the last dispensation of time. There are so many distinctives that separate us from the rest of Christianity, and many will say that that's why we aren't Christian. But as far as a theological and philosophical discussion goes, I'm interested in just looking at these stances, these positions, and figuring out, okay, where do we fit in light of what we know? And so to keep going, let's say in terms of foreknowledge, like what you said, the classical view of God is that he is maximally perfect in every way. He is omniscient. He knows everything. And the big frustration I've had with engaging with these more classically minded Christians, and you get some people in the church who adopt many of these ideas, and it's for this purpose that I think CPM can stand in as a robust way to not just have to adopt the classical view or classical arguments to say that God is perfect in every way. And so when we say omniscient, typically what we mean is, what will be said is, God knows what you will do. And if it's said, well, what if omniscience means God knows what I could do? The immediate pushback will be, if he doesn't know what you will do, then he isn't actually omniscient. It automatically collapses everything, all choices, into he knows what you will do, and you will do one thing at any given moment. So everything to God in this classical sense is already determined. He's outside of it, past, present, future. It's undifferentiated. That everything is before him in an eternal now. And in a sense, we agree with that. It's said that everything is before him in that way. Now, this gets into not so much like different theological claims that we're positing, but like I mentioned near the beginning, these are just broader philosophical ideas of what is the future, what is time. And I'll say, I'm interested in your thoughts and where you're at on this aspect of the philosophy of time and the future, what it is. But let me just say, for any of you who have made it this far and are still starting to feel like, I don't know, if this is a beneficial conversation to you, please, let's dive deeper. if you don't need to understand more deeply what the philosophy of time is to understand that Jesus Christ is your Savior, God bless. Like, go listen to the Tabernacle Choir, and that's great. Like, this isn't for everybody. It doesn't have to be, but if this is of interest to you because you're watching the Rational Theology podcast, yeah, these are the types of things that if we, like Joseph Smith said in the King Follett sermon, like, if you start a little ways off, it's hard to get it back right again. So we're starting with these very fundamental problems. We may not be the ones to crack the code, but let's go as far as we can and then continue the conversation. So LJ, yeah, I'm interested to know how you think about the philosophy of time, what the future is.
Yeah, I was interested to see that you're a growing block theorist in your model, because I think I've only read one book on the philosophy of time, but after reading it, I was kind of partial to growing block theory as well. So I guess to lay out kind of the main two theories in the philosophy of time, you have the A theory of time and the B theory of time. And I guess before I even lay those out, there's this classic quote by Augustine where he's like, whenever I think about time, or like if I'm just like casually thinking about time, it's like, yeah, I know what time is. But when you really sit down to think about it, it's like very difficult to actually pin down what time is, right? And so I guess that's a precedent for explaining why there are these competing theories for what time is, right? Because it seems like time should just be obvious, but in practice, it's actually not so simple. So I guess to start with the classical theist rendering of time, they are B theorists, or sometimes kind of synonymously called eternalists. So the B theory of time is this concept that the past, present, and future are all equally real. And so the present, there's nothing necessarily special about the present. It's just we have this kind of conceptual experience where we feel like we're experiencing the present as some privileged like section of time, but in reality, the past, present, and future are all kind of equally as real. And from God's eye view, he kind of can see all of history from the past, present, future. And it's all kind of like one with him. And kind of the way I explain it is it's like kind of like this tapestry of time. And so God, because God's not in space or in time in classical theism, and so God somehow, because he's outside of space and time, has this privileged viewpoint where he can see the past, the present, and the future as it all unfolds kind of on this tapestry of time. And so I'd say basically that's kind of the B theory of time, which has maybe some problems. And then you've got the A theory of time, which kind of says, the present is actually privileged. There is something distinct about the present. And that's, you can kind of just appeal to experience, right? Like we all experience the present as very distinct from the past, right? And to even say experiencing the future, like that's just kind of incoherent just kind of from an experiential point of view, right? Because you can kind of remember your experience of the past. You're currently experiencing your experience of the future. Not the future, the present rather, but you can't really experience the future, right? And so the sub-theory, and so if B theory is eternalist, A theory is presentist, and so the present is privileged. And so within the specific growing block theory, kind of the analogy you could draw is that time is kind of like, you're kind of like, how should I put it? You're kind of like slicing, let's say you've got like a sausage and you're like very thinly slicing this sausage, where it's like the slices that like on the knife's edge is kind of like the present, and then when a slice gets sliced off, then it becomes actual, and you can kind of view the like look at it. I guess it's not a very good analogy because in growing block the future doesn't actually exist, so there's not quite as clear of an analogy, I don't think, at least that I haven't come in contact with. But that's kind of the way I think about it. Is it's like there's like this knife slicing something, and the knife edge is kind of the present. The future can't be seen yet, but the past can kind of be looked at, and so the past kind of stacks up on itself further and further as more slices kind of get cut off. So,
Right.
anything to add?
Yeah. So the way I like to think about the way I view the future in relation to the present and the past is like making a braid. That if you were to imagine the finished part of the braid as the past, the part where it's being weaved, that's the present. That's the active part where it's coming together, and it's collapsing into what it is, and then the outcome is known. And then the future, see, okay, we're going to be hitting a lot of different points and maybe not jumping into each of them as much as they deserve. We could go on for hours and hours if we wanted to, but I'll start hitting on these points, and when we can keep folding in this comparative historical development of the ideas. But for those who, there's, like you had mentioned, the classical view is that eternalist view that the future is the same thing. It's of the same nature as the present and the past. So it's just one line. It's already done. It's just that we are experiencing it along the line. And so what we're experiencing isn't actually what reality is. It's just a point by point along that line that's already known in every sense. The opposite view, or the response to that in open theism, is that they make the claim that the future doesn't even exist. So God's omniscience, he knows everything that can be known. And so if the future doesn't exist, then God doesn't have to know it for him to be omniscient. And so that's how they try to solve that, to circle that square. What I say, going back to this braid analogy, is that there's more than one thing happening. So we have the braid that's already done, that's the past. The point of weaving, that's the present, that's right now, you and me. Everything in our life has led up to this moment. Everything in your life, listener, has led to this moment, and that's what's happening there. But then we have the threads that have yet to be woven in. And people may argue, okay, well, let's really torture this metaphor. We know certain things are part of that braid. There are certain factors. Determinism is what I'm getting at here. We know some things just by cause and effect are going to happen. So that's inevitable. What I have had a hard time seeing from any other system, and so I've had to put forth my own thinking around this, is everyone wants to say that humans do have free will and therefore do have moral responsibility. But as with Thomism and then into Calvinism, and it's all based on this classical concept of God, that he is the unmoved mover, he is the first cause, that we have to really redefine what human free will even is, because they cannot affirm libertarian free will, which open theism tries to do. But they do it by what critics will say is compromising God's character. So I'm trying to honor both. That human free will, there are agents, there is input into how the braid is being woven. Even though there are threads that we can understand, that can be predictively understood, as there are certain cause and effect things that are going to be a part of what becomes the present. So in some ways, we can understand the future as real, in that there's a predictive power that we can use even as humans. When we just say as God, he has perfect predictive power. Yet, again, our restorationist theology really strongly affirms libertarian free will, that each of us are individual co-eternal intelligences with the power of agency that is honored by God. It's a gift from him in that he honors it. And so we are genuine, in a sense, lowercase or something, if you want to say it this way, first causes of our own decisions. Now, we are, of course, influenced by many things: psychological, biological, sociological. Like, there are lots of things that we are being the object of action against, but we still choose to affirm, and this comes from Joseph Smith, and I think perhaps you can say a long line of, I think, like English philosophy, that we truly do want to believe and affirm that we make our choices, and in only that way we can be morally responsible for those choices.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, that's sort of how I think about the threads part of the braid analogy, that there are things that can be known, just natural consequence. That's the determinism factor. But there's another layer where we are giving our own input through our choices to say how that braid will come to actualization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe to give a brief definition of kind of some of these terms in the free will conversation, you kind of have, this idea of determinism, right? That all future actions are caused indefinitely by previous actions. And so it's kind of like this, I don't know what a good analogy is, but it's like you can know what's going to happen in the future. For example, if you know enough information about the physical world currently. And so indeterminism, or let's see, what should I say? A lot of people who affirm determinism, who also want to affirm free will, are called compatibilists. And so in compatibilism, they kind of redefine free will. And so there's not an agreement on what free will even means between compatibilists and people who reject determinism. So those who reject determinism are libertarians in terms of they believe in libertarian free will. And their definition of free will is the ability to have chosen otherwise. And so, for example, let's say this morning I ate cereal for breakfast. A libertarian would say, for me to really meaningfully have free will, I would have needed to have the ability to do otherwise. But a compatibilist would say, no, you don't necessarily need the ability to do otherwise, because you, and honestly, I haven't read much compatibilist literature. I don't even know if I could steel man their position. But their definition of free will is more like, because you ultimately were the cause of the effect that happened in your actions, you still were free. But they wouldn't affirm the idea that you could have chosen otherwise. And so it's kind of this interesting back and forth. And so one of the reasons I'm a libertarian is, one of the first philosophical problems I was ever introduced to was from Blake Ostler. And he gives this example in his volume 1 of Exploring Mormon Thought of, let's say God in 1900 knows that I'm going to rob 7-Eleven tomorrow. And so for me to have free will, it seems that it seems that I don't have free will, given this scenario, because if I was to somehow not rob the 7-Eleven, then I would break God's infinite foreknowledge. But if I do rob the 7-Eleven, it seems I'm constrained to rob the 7-Eleven because God in 1900 at time 1 knew it. And so at time 2, it must be the case that I rob the 7-Eleven, right? And so, but if that's the case, that God's foreknowledge causes me to do these things, then that poses big problems for repentance, for the whole plan of salvation. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. And each of the systems that I've interacted with so far, and I'm by no means an expert, I'm learning this as anyone would have to, just by getting more and more involved. As I understand, right, if we start with this idea that God is the first cause and everything is sustained by him, and we would agree that everything is sustained by God. But what they say is, because of that, we are secondary causes. That God caused us, but we can cause our own actions. And we are free in the sense that we can do according to our desire without being coerced. And so if we're not forced by some external pressure to do something, that means that we are morally responsible for that choice. That, to me, doesn't sit very well, because it still goes back to, but God caused me, and he knew what I would do. So if I rebel against him, he willed that. Now, many will make the distinction and try to defend that because, of course, every system wants to say God knows everything, he wills everything, but he's not the author of sin. So, in order for that to work, they have to say God is permissive. He has a decretive will, that there are some things that he actively says, this is my will. And he has a permissive will, that even though it's sinful, he'll let it happen and make a greater good out of it. Now, I like to use this analogy because there is what I'm finding to be just a baseline axiom of my beliefs, and you see how it feels to you. And I'll say the phrase and then give the analogy. I believe that foreknowledge necessitates moral response. And I've had a heck of a time getting anybody on any of these classical models or classically informed models to agree that that applies to God. Now, the analogy I'll give is I'm a dad. I have crazy kids. And they will say they're in the kitchen and they want a treat. They know it's on the top shelf. So they're going to start climbing the drawers to get to that treat. They will likely fall. They will likely hurt themselves in pursuit of this. It's not a sinful behavior. It's not rebellion against God and man. It's just they want a treat. But harm will likely befall them. I know that. Like, I heard them. I could tell that something's happening in there. Am I justified to say that I'm going to let that happen because I'm going to work something better? I'm going to bring about a greater good by letting them harm themselves in pursuit of this. I don't think that holds up. And I certainly wouldn't think it would hold up if I was the first cause of not only my child, but kitchens and treats and drawers and the whole situation. So I'd say that, again, foreknowledge requires a moral response. So in CPM, we're going to price that in. We're going to bake that in to whatever does happen. God responded. And they'll say it's either by decree or by will that God allowed something to happen or caused something to happen. But I would say we have a much more overtly relational theology, and we expect God to be, in every sense, in every instance, reaching out in a redemptive manner, responding to what we're doing, how we're behaving. So in that way, I'll say, if I know something ahead of time, I'm required to respond. We know that God knows everything ahead of time, so we can assume there is a response in that. And I think none of the other models that we've talked about so far, actually, let's bring up Molinism for a little bit, because that came around the same time as Calvinism and its reactionary, more progressive, softer alternative of Arminianism, which I think more people are Arminian than Calvinist, at least in this sense. Molinism says, you had mentioned how the Blake Ostler's scenario, which, please forgive me if there's so much of this that is just rehashing things that Blake has already gone over. I know he's like the lead guy on this, so I'm definitely figuring things out along the way, and Blake has done great work. So please, Blake, if you ever listen to this, let's talk, because I have a lot to learn. But
yeah,
in his analogy,
have you read Volume 1?
Not yet. I've done
Okay.
a lot of his podcast and interviews and things like that, but I really need to crack open those books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah, because he goes pretty rigorously over the whole free will stuff. I think it's
Right.
from like chapter 5 through 9, some around there. But
Yeah. So the way Molinists, like there's one guy today, William Lane Craig, he's a Molinist. He really, I find it to be unsatisfying because it seems like a logical trick. So to go back to that scenario that Blake presented and you shared, if God knew in 1900 what I would have for breakfast today, I would have to defy God's perfect, infallible foreknowledge to do otherwise, which seems to suggest that I don't have a choice to do otherwise, because I can't change what God knew in 1900. So that I'm constrained to do the thing that God knew I would do. Now, the way they try to get around this is by saying knowledge doesn't necessitate that action. So foreknowledge is not causation. And I think that that's not a very appropriate way of thinking about it, because it denies or ignores this very intuitive moral reality that, back to my being a dad analogy, if I know something is going to happen, it would be negligent for me to not intercede in that very thing. We can talk about the atonement being the great and final and infinite intercession for all of us, but I'm talking about immediate. Like we're diving into the problem of evil now. So all of these things interconnect, and it all comes back down to what is the nature of God and who are we to Him. So I'm interested in some of your thoughts there.
And which question specifically?
What do you think about this idea that where Molinism would say, well, foreknowledge doesn't necessitate causation, so God can know what you're going to do, but it doesn't mean He caused you to do it, so you're still responsible. Well, if God knew that I was going to be violently attacked by another person, it doesn't mean that His knowledge caused it, but it does imply that as any agent, we believe God to be the most moral of agents, it would imply that you knew what would happen. What? And we get quickly into, well, you can't judge God because He created everything. Well, if He's the source of all morality, then He should have some sort of defensible or understandable method of how He goes about being moral. It should be understandable to us.
Yeah, no, I think on Molinism or the more Augustinian views, simple foreknowledge type things, something for me that's kind of confusing is it seems that God, even God Himself, would be a puppet, right? Because He's seen how He will react already, and so there seems to kind of be this infinite feedback loop. And so I don't know. I haven't done enough research into the defenses of those types of things, but I think the appeal to me of a more open theistic system is that God can actually respond in the moment, right? Because I think I guess one connection we haven't explicitly made yet is the idea that because God can't exhaustively know the future, He is actually open to responding in the present moment. And of course He can plan ahead for things. But yeah, if He's seen something that will happen, it's almost hard to understand how God can actually intervene in affairs if the B theory of time is the case. And I think you can mitigate that by saying that God is outside of time and space. I think just like even the concepts of how kind of above our ability to conceive of that, I think you can there's some wiggle room there, but seeing as the LDS God is constrained to spatio-temporal restrictions, I don't think we can even use any of those sorts of ways of getting around it, or even just like a general appeal to mystery. And so, yeah, I don't know. I am more sympathetic to open theism for the reason that because the future can't exist, God can plan ahead, but He doesn't have exhaustive foreknowledge of future events. So does that kind of get at what you're saying?
And I think one of the reasons why this conversation has not been settled, even after these many centuries and generations, is it can be hard to really pin down definitions of words, because we use such common use vocabulary to describe these things, but we tend to mean or imply different things about it. So, for example, when we say exhaustive foreknowledge, it goes back to that idea of God must know what you will do, and that has to lead to that classical determinist view that there's one thing, God knows it, so that's that, and you can act according to your desires within what God has already decreed. And that's the compatibilist classical view. I'm not satisfied with that, and maybe this is all part of the single string of reality that I'm along. I'm on a little squiggle, and eventually God will help me realize that there really is just one single outcome from the beginning. But I think it's important to think more clearly about where we're coming from in our own theology. That, like you said, God is, it's a really nice and neat way to solve some problems by saying, well, God is just outside of time. Okay, that solves some problems, it creates some problems. To say that God is inside of time and that God is eternally embodied, that solves some problems and that creates some problems. So I'd actually be interested to hear from you, LJ, how you think about the critique that God has to be immaterial. God has to be prior to creation, outside of time. And to be any of those things, like we believe the resurrected Jesus Christ to be, that would be some sort of hindrance. That would make him less than the most perfect being.
Yeah, I think what this comes down to is a prioritization of a philosophical concept over special revelation, right? Because from the revelations, and I mean, even as a philosophical theologian, you have to prioritize the revelations, I think, over philosophical concepts, even if it seems, even if the LDS God to you seems too finitistic. If you do believe in Old Testament, New Testament, and restoration scripture, kind of the best way to piece those together makes God out to be pretty distinct from the classical God. And so I think it just stems from this conception of rationalism over empiricism, where it's like, before we even look at the revelations, we're going to decide how God has to be. We're going to put God into a box and then make the revelations fit that box, rather than saying, let's look at what we actually know. Let's look at our empirical data, our special revelation, and then fit our philosophy into that box of revelation. And so I think that's kind of where the scholastic era theologians kind of went into, I don't want to say apostasy, but, from our point of view, kind of a more apostate view of God, where they privilege these philosophical, rationalistic conceptions above special revelation. And I guess I'll caveat this by saying I'm actually going to the LDS Philosophy Project workshop next week, and the first talk is a BYU philosophy professor who's arguing, and it's so interesting. He's arguing that the LDS God has to be the classical God, and so he's got a very interesting argument for it. But so it's and that's just to say that LDS theological diversity is very broad. But I think the classical God idea of, God can't be God if he doesn't possess these properties. It's like, well, hold on, let's consult the revelations first, and then let's go back to philosophy.
Right. And to get to the heart of it, right, the covenant possibility model is really trying to start with those special revelations from what we have in our standard works and continuing throughout this last dispensation, where the classical and classically informed models start with God must be this in order to be God, having those philosophical constraints, and then building in how do we justify it through Scripture. And maybe that's unfair. Maybe it's a back and forth process, right? But there are certain commitments that are made philosophically to justify the doctrine. And that to me, I think whenever we do that, we really have to look extra carefully. But for us, we understand that man was in the beginning with God, that matter and intelligence cannot be created or destroyed. They are co-eternal with God. That doesn't mean that we are co-equal necessarily in glory. We have the potential to be. We truly believe that the promises God makes in Scripture, we just believe that the most of all Christians. We take it to its logical conclusion, and we get criticized for it. I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding. But when we start with LJ, Sam, listener, you are a co-eternal intelligence with God, and a fundamental and essential aspect of who you are is that you are an agent. And the way I try to pull together what that even means to be an agent, I think about these two rules when I think about what an agent is. An agent is someone who insists on using or exercising that agency. If you have an ability to choose, you insist on the right to choose. And secondly, an agent refuses to have that ability violated. And so with these two fundamental ideas, if we think of ourselves as eternal intelligences, and God being the most relational, the most perfect, the most loving in all things, law, like eternal law as we understand it, often we get criticized or misunderstood, because the classical view of God is that God is not only the lawgiver, but he is the law itself. He's he is the book of law code, as well as the judge, as well as your as well as your defense attorney through Jesus Christ, right? He's all of it. He's everything. And we get criticized often for saying, oh, well, your God, your concept of God is he has to work within certain laws. There are laws that are above him. So we should be worshiping those higher laws because they're superior to him. He's subordinate to these laws out there. The way I try to resolve that tension is by saying that, and LJ, maybe you can help me be more precise in this, and you might have some disagreements here in how I'm phrasing this, but these things are eternal in the same sense that relationships are eternal. That what's emergent is relational law. That when two agents interact, they have to abide by at least those first two laws of I have to have my right to choose, and if it's violated, there has to be justice. So building out from there, we start understanding, okay, I'm actually, the more I read about this philosopher, Emanuel Levinas, who's a 20th century Lithuanian Jew, went through the Holocaust, and he developed this idea in response to a lot of other philosophies of the 20th century that ethics is the first philosophy. That before anything we start conceptualizing and intellectualizing about how we are to treat each other, what's the greatest good. You think about Immanuel Kant and how he talks about the categorical imperative, which is only do the thing. Think about this, like the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And he really expands that and formalizes it to only do the thing that you would want everybody to do. Right? Okay. That's a very relational way of looking at it. Levinas, he goes even a step further from, say, Kant or Martin Buber, who Osler, Blake references as well. Martin Buber, he talks about the I-thou relationship, that recognizing there is a me and there is a you, and instead of me treating you as an object, I'm going to treat you as another, in a way, divine, sovereign, worthy of respect, worthy of deference and relation, the I-thou relationship. Levinas goes even further in saying before even the idea of reciprocity, we are met with this idea of responsibility towards the other. And he often gives this example of, if you are at a restaurant, just say like a fast food joint, eating a burger, and you saw somebody outside, homeless, obviously hungry, incapable of caring for themselves. If you met eyes, if you really saw them as a person, as another person, it's his way of saying it, that you wouldn't just share it. You wouldn't just share your food. You would give him all of your food. Like, it's that sense of relationality that he's after, and how I like to inform my idea around how God is with us and how he's trying to help us be with each other. So a lot of these things float around. Yes, there's the open theism. We can talk about the variant called process theology. All of these things have advantages and disadvantages, but I'm just trying to bring together what we know from our own revelation and why a lot of these models don't account for what we know about God and who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I was interested reading through your covenant possibility model, and you talk about this relational law, and so you kind of talked about it just now, but like, what exactly do you mean by relational law? So like, are you like a and I haven't read any Levinas. I mean, obviously I've heard of him, but I'm not very familiar with his ethical system or anything. And so are you like a moral realist, or, because I was reading this and I was kind of, I don't know, like, what do you mean by relational law, I guess?
Yeah. So I'll lead by saying that there's obviously so much of moral philosophy that we can spend years studying, just as personal study. And so the more I learn, the more refined these ideas get. But I bring it up to say that instead of there being some eternal law that is above God, and God has to obey that law, or in another sense, how it's sometimes talked about, God self-limits so that he can interact and respond with his creation. I think there's just something fundamental about, if you have two agents and they interact, there are going to be rules that naturally pop up. And the more that relation is carried throughout time, the more opportunities there are for there to be violation of agency, as well as an opportunity to grow closer in honoring that agency. Now, what we bring in here with our theology is how Christ is essential through his atonement for us to repent of such violations, to be forgiven, and to forgive, so that we can open back up the possibilities of the future of things going in a better direction. So, for me, relational law means it's this emergent thing that happens between any two agents. And God understands it, God knows it, when we as a person, as two people, as a collective, as a ward, as a stake, right? As we choose to do that, even though we stumble and even though we constantly need repentance, that's what the city of Enoch is. That's what Zion is. It's everybody. I don't think it's some sort of like kumbaya, everybody be nice to each other platitude. It's something very deep and fundamental to the nature of who we are as eternal intelligences.
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe a question I have then is, what grounds God as God? Because like, for example, in my system, which is also it's just a working system. I mean,
sure.
I haven't worked everything out yet, but I'm a moral realist. And I think what, for me, grounds God as God is the fact that he's in perfect compliance with the moral law, moment to moment, out of his free will. But it seems that in your system, if God is, or if ethical truth values and things are emergent from specific relationships, then what exactly are those grounded in, if that makes sense? Because it would seem that if, like, for example, we're in a or two people come in contact with each other, there would probably be some sort of prior ethical law that would determine the specific way they should interact in that instance, rather than the law emerging from it, if that makes sense.
Sure. And let me know if I'm picking up on what you're getting at here, because my response would be, this is where we can get very practical and like anthropological, sociological pretty quickly, because if it's you and me, LJ, being English-speaking Americans, yeah, there's going to be a lot of cultural common ground that we understand etiquette, we understand perhaps a lot of baseline things that help us relate to each other. But I often think of Ferdinand Magellan, the first man to have led a crew across the globe, to circumnavigate the globe. He didn't make it himself all the way across the globe, but his crew did, some of them. And the thing was that he got murdered by some natives in what's now Indonesia. There can be culturally informed ways to relate to each other that wouldn't necessarily be some eternal law. That there's going to be things that are, okay, this is the etiquette of how we do things here. That's not going to be how you think of it. There are plenty of like intercultural communications courses in business and all sorts of things in government that there are going to be some things that are counterintuitive to you, just given who you were raised to be, versus someone from Tanzania. Okay? Mm-hmm. That just being a very like down-to-earth practical reason to get back to this more like first principles intellectual side of things. I do agree that God is in perfect compliance with those things, with moral law, in the sense that there is something, the phenomenology, the way we experience each other, the world, the way we're embodied, the way the human experience is, there is something intrinsic, instinctive about admiration, about respect. And God does that for every person. There may be plenty of things, sin and rebellion, that keep us from feeling that, but I see it as God is worthy of our worship. God is glorious because we give him that respect and admiration as agents, because he is the one who relates to us most perfectly.
Interesting. So I guess in your example of kind of like the natives who killed Magellan, kind of the way I would work that out in my system is that it's not that, and this is another critique, and I'm not trying to be super harsh on you or anything. It's
no,
just,
please, like
it's
I
good
need
back
help.
And forth discourse. Yeah, but it just your system seems to almost break down into moral relativism, because the way I would mitigate that situation where the native killed Magellan, I would say that's not the moral truth value of that is still that was an immoral action, right? Because according to the eternal law, to take this sort of extreme example, it's very rarely justified to kill, right? And so it's never justified to murder on a certain definition of murder, right? And so if Magellan's murdered by this native who, in his own cultural context, that's not that crazy of a thing to happen, right? Something I think about is, God of the Book of Mormon talks about how it'll be harsher for the Nephites in the day of judgment than for the Lamanites, because of the Lamanites' wicked traditions of their fathers, right? And so I think there's an epistemic sort of mitigation in judgment that it's still bad for Lamanites, still bad for kind of more primitive cultures to kill, but because they're working in a different cultural context, they have different epistemic circumstances, the judgment will be easier for them, not because the moral truth value was different in that situation, but because the epistemic quality of that interaction was different. So, because, like, for example, it would be, I think, the same moral value for me to kill somebody as for a more primitive type person to kill somebody, but I will be held more accountable for it, not because what I did was less moral, but because my epistemic conditions made it so that I was I'm sinning against greater light, so to speak.
Right.
So does that make sense?
Well, and I don't think I have any problem agreeing with you that those who sin against the greater light comes the greater condemnation, right? And those without the law are judged according to their knowledge. So yeah, there's different layers there, because right, there are some people just with less, as you said, like epistemic knowledge and having that revealed to them and understood. At the same time, I still think it's relevant for us to understand there are going to be, it's easy and tempting to, as say, well, let's just speak as who we are, just as Americans, to think there's a certain general ethic of what is good behavior, what is morality. And if we go to another place in the world, say like Malaysia, we would say there's a lot of corruption in Malaysia, where they would say this is how you get stuff done. Like, this is just business as usual. And so our ability to gauge how God judges each person in each circumstance, I leave that to him. But I'm not just abandoning this idea of there being an overall eternal ethic or morality.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So then, okay. So then you would say there is like an eternal, immutable moral law then.
Well, and I would frame it in the sense that, like I said before, God perfectly relates to each of us as agents. That if there's agent A, you or me, and then agent B is God, God is forever and always loyal, truthful, responsive, and he's always doing the right thing in that context according to how we see things. So, and we talked about killing in different cultural contexts and history and all that. And that's quite a serious thing. I mean to simply capture this idea that we are individual and we each come from our own cultural contexts. So God relating to each of us in a blanket way is not necessarily how a perfect morality would look. That it would be individual in every way.
Interesting. Yeah. And so then for you, God is what grounds God as God is more the fact that he perfectly relates to all people, rather than him fitting some sort of compliance with an eternal law. Or would you say it's like the same thing?
Well, right, and this is like the kind of the maze or the minefield that I along with many others are trying to navigate. Some may find satisfying solutions in things that have already been talked about, but what seems more satisfying to me is God is not subordinate to some overarching eternal laws of reality. He is not the self-limiting one so that he can even interact with creation in a strict or binding sense. The things that come up as natural or moral law, well, let's stick with moral law, because I do think they deserve to be talked about differently. That comes back to determinism versus agent causation. Moral law, relational law, I see as directly and maybe exclusively related to us as agents, rather than natural law, which a lot of determinists, I think, try to just lump in humans with, we're just a bunch of processes playing out. I'd say that God is God. He is worthy of worship. What grounds him is that he is the thing. He is the one who understands these emergent interactions between agents, between how we interact with reality. He understands those things perfectly, and he can see that he understands that overall emergent law. So it's not going to be starting from square one every time one agent interacts with a new agent that they've never interacted with. That there is wisdom, there is understanding of how things ought to be. It's just that he also relates perfectly to each agent as they go along and develop.
Interesting. Yeah. And my grasp of ethical philosophy is not the best, but I don't know. It seems to me that if God's not grounded in kind of that eternal moral law, then I don't know what would ground God as God, because it seems to me your system seems to be kind of getting closer to moral relativism. At least just that's kind of what it seems to me. In that, would you say that it's like I don't even have the terminology to phrase these questions, I don't think. But I don't know. I guess in my
just to refresh, explain to me again what you mean by what is meant by moral realism.
Yeah, so moral realism is kind of this concept that prior to God, or I guess it kind of comes from this thing called the Euthyphro dilemma. So have you've heard of that?
Right.
Yeah. And so
explain it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's this idea of it's from one of Plato's dialogues, and so essentially the question is, what makes God, or how do you phrase it? It's like
what makes good good.
Yeah, what's prior? Is good stuff good because God says it's good, or is God good because God complies with the good, more or less? And so it's this question of divine command theory, which is the idea that things are good because God says they're good, versus moral realism, which is the idea that God can't just declare something good. God is good contingently. And so there's the moral law is prior to God. And so I take the more moral I'm kind of like I haven't found a term that exactly corresponds with this, but I think I'm like a modified divine command theorist, in that I think God, I'm a moral realist, but I do think our access to the moral law comes from God. And so it's not divine command theory because it's not good because God says it's good, but we know that it's good because God says it's good. And so I don't know, for me, what makes God God is the fact that he does comply with this eternal law of ethics, this eternal ethical law. And kind of a working definition I have for godhood is, what it means to be God is to stand in perfect relationality with all other intelligences and even all of creation itself by possessing all knowledge and all moral attributes to their fullness. But the problem is, at least it seems to me on your system, if one of the brute facts of the universe isn't certain moral truth values, certain laws of morality, then it seems that God can't be grounded in such a perfect possession of moral attributes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and honestly, I could do for more engagement with that perspective, and in just off the cuff, while we're in conversation, my response would be along the lines that I think perhaps it goes back to this grounding nature of what it means to be an agent. And I think, right, going back to in the Pearl of Great Price, we get this idea that God is God because we give him our glory. We give him glory. We give him praise. I think there's something instinctive, something natural, something that can't be faked about wanting, desiring to give someone your respect and admiration and love. And God does that. God is worthy of that. So in a way, the groundedness of God's perfection is how we assess him, how we as agents naturally, instinctively praise and honor him in the to the extent that we know him. But we understand in pre-earth life that the host of heaven that chose to keep their first estate, we shouted for joy. We sang praises to God because we loved and honored him in what he chose to do for us. So, yeah. How do you think about that? The whole CPM thing, instead, it's basically like the exact opposite of how these classical models go. That instead of, we're going to start with some philosophical commitments, like we can only logically, rationally defend a God that obeys these things. So, and then we'll start leading into what the character and nature of God must be. What I'm saying basically is perhaps one of the most heretical anthropocentric ideas, that God is God because we have the ability to honor him, and that honor is what gives that, and we instinctually do it because he perfectly relates to us.
Interesting. A couple of objections that just immediately come to mind. The first one, so I'm curious, would you say that God became like 1/3 less God when Satan led away a third part of the host of heaven? Or am I misunderstanding your grounding of God? Because it seems to me that if we all just collectively decided, and this I think is leading back to my my feelings of moral relativism. It seems to me that if we all decide collectively, okay, now it's okay to go around and kill people, then that would make that the case, right? Because if God's godhood is grounded in our kind of consent to that, our desire to worship him as God, but we all collectively say that it's moral to kill people, and if God doesn't comply with that, then we would either leave God because now, he's not perfectly moral, or God would conform to that and thus be immoral. Or at least, because I imagine neither of us would agree to the idea that it is ever moral to I guess murder, I should say. What would you say to that?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting ideas that I'm considering in many ways for the first time. And so how I'd react to that is going back to Emmanuel Levinas and his idea of the other. So he talks about the other as being, look, LJ, you and I, we're talking, I was going to say face to face, but audibly, we're speaking to each other through the power of the internet for the first time. And I get to see your face, I get to hear your voice, and you get to do the same for me. Yet, there is something just infinitely unknowable about each other. That there is so much about you, your history, who you are, how you think, what you desire, that if I ever tried to just sum that up into, okay, yeah, I get LJ, I know who he is, I know what he's about, that itself, Levinas would deem essentially a sin to collapse somebody into just something that you think you can know 100%. So when we talk about the other, it's in a sense honoring that there is so much about that other person I can't even try to understand them fully, rather than choose to relate with them continually in a way that honors their agency and produces an asymmetrical moral responsibility toward the other. That comes before basically anything else. And that's what God represents. That's how he behaves. He represents or enacts this asymmetrical responsibility toward the other. And so I get what you're saying, that, okay, well, if we just all decided that we're going to do the purge one night a year, everything's, off the or on the table, rather. We can do whatever we want for 12, 24 hours and no one gets in trouble. Well, in that sense, sure, I'd be happy to say that, yeah, there's something that we can't just all decide that morality is going to be a different way. There are going to be some things where if it's in violation of the other, if it violates agency, then, and we can contextualize that. I talked about, having this cultural context to things where what you might think is appropriate may not be appropriate to someone else, given their cultural context. If we're talking about these absolutes and the extreme of murder, that's where we start hitting bedrock. We're like, yeah, there's no way that you can get around, okay, yeah, murder is justified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I don't know, kind of the way I look at, in terms of talking about, and again, I don't really know, I've never read Levinas, so I can't really speak to him exactly, but I think the way, in my system, in my anthropology, it seems that in the state that we are currently in, we have kind of a restricted epistemology. It's like Paul says, we see now through a glass darkly, but then when that which is perfect has come, we'll see in full, right? And so, there's this other verse in Moroni 7, the last verse, 48, right? And he says, pray unto the Father with all the energy of your heart, that you may become the sons of God, that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is, that we may have this hope, that we may be purified even as he is pure. And so in the way I see things, I think part of exaltation, part of Christification, deification, and I think what it means to stand in perfect relationality to all other beings and creation itself is to actually know. And so kind of contra, it seems, Levinas, where I think perfection entails, seeing Christ as he is, seeing our fellow beings as they are, and really knowing what they are. And I have maybe my favorite theologian of all time, besides Osler, is this Orthodox theologian called Dumitru Stăniloae, Romanian guy, and he talks about how theosis is a complete obliteration of any sort of mediation between us and God, and that entails, in the Orthodox system, you can't know God's essence. That's just metaphysically impossible. But to perfectly participate in his energies, and so for us, I think it actually would entail perfectly knowing his essence as well, right? Because God isn't the perfect moral law like he is in classical theism. He is just the perfect embodiment of that perfect moral law. And so you brought up earlier, like how some people might talk about, why don't we just worship the law rather than the person of God? And the reason is that moral law that is immutable. So we can't even, we couldn't worship it if we wanted to. And so we can worship the Father, though we can worship Christ, in terms of the fact that they are people that are in space and time, and so we can interact with them. And so I don't know if that makes sense. That's just some thoughts I had.
Sure. Well, I mean, first let me ask you then, how do you think of people who do worship an immaterial, immutable being?
Even by their own standards, they can't. So
how do you mean?
well, because God is immutable, they can't actually interact with him, because that's what it means to be, or impassible rather. I'm using the wrong term. Because God's impassible, we can't actually interact with him because he's wholly other. He's supraessential, which is to say that he's not even a being, right? And so because we're humans, and that's kind of in Orthodox theology, like I mentioned, you can't know the essence of God because the essence of God is supraessential. And so it's outside of being. But because, and so I think, well, and I haven't exactly pinned this down entirely,
sure,
but I think the moral law for us exists, but it is also supraessential, and that we can't actually like interact with it in terms of, and this is kind of a critique of like classical theistic worship, that you can't actually worship God because you can't interact with God because he's outside of being, and so you're just a finite being, and so Orthodox theology has ways of mitigating that. They have the essence energies distinction, but I think it's kind of devastating for Thomism, and so I'd say they can't even worship the Thomistic conception of God, because they can't interact with God, the same way as we can't worship the moral law because we can't interact with the moral law. We can interact with the moral law insofar as we embody it, or comply with it, but it's not like the physical, the way we can actually worship God and the Son, or the Father and the Son, who are in time and space. So I don't know. Those are just some thoughts. I haven't entirely developed those sorts of things. Just some things I've thought.
No, that's interesting. And to go back to the little either of us collectively understand the work of Emmanuel Levinas. I was attracted to him and bring him up to say, when, as far as I understand, to the extent I understand, when he is talking about refusing to totalize, he uses the word totalize to condense down who a person is, to try to say, yeah, I know everything I need to know about you on a note card kind of thing, to totalize, versus infinity, to respect them as like a locus of consciousness that you will never fully understand. Like, it is just in our finite bodies, in our finite experience at least. I fully agree with your opposite side of that to be perfect, to be exalted, means to see and be seen to the fullest extent, psychologically, spiritually. And so if Levinas doesn't mean it this way, at least I do, that this idea of refusing to totalize the other, to accept them as a source of infinite understanding and exploration, that's more to inform a posture of that asymmetrical moral responsibility rather than to dehumanize them. So it's more a way to put your posture.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, we're kind of running low on time. Is there anything else you want to go into before we close out?
Yeah, of course, again, I say I welcome any and all conversation about this. You can connect with me. We can keep talking, you and me, LJ, because look, you're deep in the woods as far as this philosophical and theological study and education goes. So I appreciate you getting to have a conversation with you. Just to sum up what I'm proposing the covenant possibility model to be, it's trying to thread the needle in a lot of different ways, and it deserves scrutiny and criticism so that we can be more precise in how we talk about this. But it's my hope that not only can this develop into something that for so many Latter-day Saints it's pretty intuitive, or we're left with a lot of classically informed models to try to adapt to our distinct doctrines and beliefs. I want this to be something that from the ground up we're starting with God the Father is embodied. We are co-eternal intelligences with God. That blows apart all base assumptions about how we build out and answer questions from there. So in that sense, I'll just summarize it in saying, okay, in the covenant possibility model, and by the way, the working title is covenant possibility because the atonement and covenants with God open up possibility. Where if you think about let's go back to that braid analogy. If we were thinking about it more as like a timeline, a graph of like how things are going in your life. Well, we understand that we have a fallen nature. We don't accept original guilt, original sin. There's a distinct understanding around what that means. But because of our fallen nature, the trajectory is pretty much low. And it will keep going lower until it can't go any lower. Now, the purpose of the atonement in that sense is to open things back up, to allow us a trajectory that returns us into more pro-social, but even more than that, more communion with God. Not just, sociological, happy, kumbaya sort of thing, but really a deeply, existentially, and religious experience of communion with God with our spouse, with our fellow man. So all that to say, there's ways to thread these needles, and it's been really helpful for me to understand where the conversation has been historically, so that I can understand better why no one seems to agree. Everyone seems to have their own idea because no explanation so far has been fully satisfactory.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Sweet. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm also trying to make my own personal systematic theology, so I've appreciated getting to engage with you, and I look forward to a lot more future engagements. And yeah, I'll drop your socials in the description so people can reach out to you. But yeah, thanks for coming on, Sam.
Great. Thank you, LJ.
Yeah. And we'll see you all next time.